So I have spent many, many years working with superintendents and university presidents and leaders on risk mitigation or risk management. It's really the foundation of what started Social Sentinel, the idea that there were risks on digital conversations and in the like that needed to be mitigated. So one of the formulas that we've used is this formula that risk is a combination of consequence, vulnerability, and probability. Now, I didn't come up with this formula. This was the Sandia National Labs in New Mexico, but we've adapted it for education, and I've been using it for a long, long time. And what I want to do is walk you through how you can use it with your district and with your leadership team in the superintendent's office. It's pretty straightforward. You can do it by yourself, just on a list of risks that you want to try to prioritize and get a handle on. You can do it with a larger group to facilitate a conversation, and you'll see how that works. But at the end of the day, the formula gives you and the process gives you the ability to assign and rank order risk so that you understand maybe what you have to deal with first. Because look, you have many risks in a school district, and they're the kind of risks that keep folks like you and I awake at night. There is a way to handle them and a way to manage them and prioritize them using this formula. So let's dive into it and we can see what it looks like. So risk is a combination of three things: consequence, vulnerability, and probability. So what does that mean? So when we look at consequence, and these are on a scale of 1 to 5, when we look at consequence, we're thinking, what is the impact if this risk manifested? It could be the impact on classes, the district. In some instances, it's the impact on you as the superintendent or as the assistant superintendent or as a leader in the school community. What are the consequences if this risk happened? Again, on a scale of 1 to 5, each of these is a 1 to 5 scale. So that when it's done and all the math works itself out, you'll be able to rank order a number of risks on a scale of 1 to 125. So the second one is vulnerability. How vulnerable is the district to this particular risk? Again, with a group of people thinking about this, you get multiple perspectives in each of these. Doing it individually is kind of a back of the napkin orientation in your own mind of where these may play themselves out. And then probability. What's the likelihood that this risk could manifest or happen in the district? And probability is impacted by a number of factors that we'll again get into here in a second. So let's use an example, and let's use the example of a foodborne illness or food poisoning in the lunchroom as a risk that may keep us up at night that we can use as this example. So I'm going to write foodborne illness up here. So if we look at foodborne illness and we think of consequence, if the district experienced a foodborne illness, a pathogen or food poisoning or the like, what on a scale of 1 to 5, what would be the consequence of that? Now, again, there are many ways to think of consequences. There could be political consequences. There could be consequences on a practical level, on a health level. But if for the sake of this, if we put it all together for this exercise, what are the consequences on a scale of 1 to 5? 1 being lowest, 5 being highest. I would think that if an entire class or an entire grade or half the school were to come down with food poisoning because of something coming out of the food services group, that would be a pretty significant consequence. So probably a 4 or a 5. And guessing depending on the size and the scope of the illness, right? So for the sake of this, we'll use a 4. Could have used a 5. For the sake of this exercise, pick 4. Vulnerability. How vulnerable is the district to foodborne illnesses? Now, I'm going to think this one through because there are many factors that impact this. So first of all, if you're employing a food service and a kitchen that is meeting state and federal standards for cleanliness and health and the like, then chances of you being vulnerable to this is pretty low. So you've got a director of food services, someone running the kitchen, a professional organization. Maybe they're in-house, maybe they're outsourced, but they're using all the contemporary standards for food management and food preparation and cooking and the like. So vulnerability on this, I mean, I think there's always some vulnerability, but is it on the low end or the high end? I think it's probably on the low end for the sake of identifying this risk. So we're going to give it a 2 for this exercise. Now, in terms of probability, how probable is it? How likely is it that the district could be affected by a foodborne illness? Now, depending on the size of the district, if you're a 3,000 student, let's say a 5,000 student district with faculty and staff, you're probably feeding every day somewhere around 5,500, 6,000 people, again, depending on the size of the district and the way it works. So if you look at that size of an organization, the likelihood or the probability that you would have something happen could be significant. Given what we know about the other things, is it it's definitely going to happen and likely to happen, or is it not really? Just for the sake of this conversation, let's put it at a 3. You could argue this amongst the team and kind of debate back and forth, which healthy debate's important when you do these kind of exercises. You want multiple perspectives on what this looks like, but we're going to give it a 3, which means we're able to assign a risk score for this particular risk of foodborne illness of 4 times 2 is 8 times 3 is a 24. So here you have the ability to assign foodborne illness to a number on a scale of 1 to 125. You'll notice here that we used a number of other examples where I walked through similar scenario here. So for weather-related challenges, so again, it depends on where you are. We're here in the Northeast, we're in Vermont. We typically don't get monsoons and hurricanes. We typically get snowstorms and ice storms. We could get those, but we tend to get, snow-related weather as such. So you would expect that when we do this, we may even break this out further in types of weather incidences. We may group them together. There's a number of ways to do that. And in fact, one of the things you'll notice is that on one of the links below, we have a worksheet for you I believe it's in Google Sheets that you can actually click and download it. It has a lot of this pre-populated that you can manipulate and change and look at and like. But targeted violence, again, these are the active shooter, the targeted violence scenarios. High impact, low probability, and we're going to talk about that number on a scale of 1 to 125. You may be looking saying, well, why is that a 25? Why isn't that 125? Well, because again, it may be significant vulnerability to a targeted act of targeted violence, may be significant consequence. So if you gave each of these a 5, but what's the probability of that happening in your district? And statistically, the likelihood and the probability is very low. So you can see how we could end up with a number of 25, but we're gonna talk about how that still gets mitigated here in a moment. So let's move on to the others. Transportation risks, field trips, after-school programs, self-harm. Again, I worked through these myself. I didn't take into account your specific district needs or your specific district history or where you are. This is, again, an example, but something that you would do either alone to kind of get a back of the napkin or with your leadership team. And we create this list, and each of these is assigned a number. And then you're able to make a decision. So look, if you sat down to do this and you come up with brainstorming 100 different risks, you might be a little overwhelmed. So you sit down and you brainstorm either alone or with your team, 12 risks, and you walk through this exercise and they end up with these numbers. And when you map them out on a scale of 1 to 125, you begin to see clusters and patterns. You may decide, for example, we're gonna begin to mitigate anything with a score above an 80. Doesn't mean you're not going to address the others. You're going to address all of them in some way, shape, or form, but you got to start somewhere, and you got to be able to recognize where those that you may be most vulnerable for need to start, or that are the greatest risk number to start first. And so in this particular case, we scored foodborne illness at a 24 on this scale. Others scored higher, right, as such. So you may, for example, be focusing on bullying, maybe one of your top risk priorities that you're going to mitigate through a number of different factors. Programming, intervention, mental health counseling, whatever you're going to put a plan together to deal with that, this may be high on that list. Threats of violence that are shared on social media and digital platforms. We know today that the vast majority of our students have digital devices. They are nearly all online. The conversation is happening online. 40 to 50% of targeted violence in schools was telegraphed on these digital platforms just in the last 2 years. The new research is coming out shortly. There's a significant impact, cyberbullying, bullying. So you know that you need to address this. So that may be the first two. At the same time, let's go back up to targeted violence. big consequence, big vulnerability, low probability. But I can tell you that political influence begins to fall in, and practical influence. Every district needs to have some kind of a plan to mitigate targeted violence. Now, dealing with bullying and threats of violence address a lot of that on the front end, because you're proactive in interacting with kids who may need help and such before they may get to the point of targeted violence, however that looks. But you're still going to have a targeted violence plan. So you begin to see how this gives you a starting point, and then there's little adjustments that you might make. But at the end of the day, when this is done, you end up with a reasonable strategy to mitigate reasonable risks. You've looked at the risks that you brainstormed that keep you up at night. You've gone through a logical progression of assigning them a value to understand where they fit in the risk profile. Where do I got to mitigate first? You adjust them a little bit. I had one colleague, it indicated that maybe this is actually R equals CVP squared, where the second P is the political influence, because there are always board politics, community politics, and what you need to address. There may have been a prior incident that, even though it's a very low probability, it's happened in the district already, and therefore mitigating that particular risk rises it to the top of the list. All of this gives you a tool. So when someone calls you and says, Madam or Mr. Superintendent, what are you doing about X, Y, and Z? A reasonable response becomes, we've looked at that particular set of risks. We've analyzed them. They are in our queue. We are addressing them. They will be addressed in short order after several other higher risks have been prioritized. A number of ways you want to say it, but at the end of the day, this is a very, very simple, easy to use tool to give you a sense of what you're facing, how to mitigate it, and a little bit of control over what's coming at you and how you're going to address it. So I hope this was helpful. For more information, go to www.socialsentinel.com. Feel free to reach out, and have a great start to the school year.